Welcome to Promote, Profit, Publish. This is Juliet Clark, your host. And before we get started with today's guest, I want to remind you to go over to YouTube and subscribe to us, Superbrand Publishing. If you're listening to this, you can actually see the videos over there. You can see the faces of my bright and shiny guests that are here. Don't forget to go over and take our Promote, Profit, Publish quiz, promoteprofitpublishquiz.com. Find out if you're ready to actually publish. Do you have the visibility? Are you going to have a real bestseller or a flop? You really don't want that flop. And lastly, you're listening to us. If you have good things to say, and really, if you only have good things to say, otherwise go away, we'd love to invite you over to iTunes and leave us a review. Our guest is laughing, but we only want good ones, darn it. So remember, go over, if you're listening all the time, you're binging it, please go tell us what you think of it. So today's guest is going to be a little bit different and very interesting for those of you who want to do audiobooks. Tina Dietz is an award-winning and internationally acclaimed speaker, audiobook publisher, podcast producer, and vocal leadership expert who's been featured on media outlets including ABC, Inc.com, Huffington Post, and Forbes. Tina's first podcast, The Start Something Show, wasn't that a movie? Oh, no, it was something to talk about. Never mind. Was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 35 podcasts for entrepreneurs. In 2016, Tina was the recipient of the Evolutionary Business Council More Award, and in 2017, she received an award for Outstanding Audio Company from the Winner's Circle. She's also a member of the EBC Leadership Body and a founding member of the Forbes Coaches Council. Tina's also the lead interview in the podcasting documentary, The Messengers, and the featured film. She splits her time between the U.S. and Costa Rica, where she's part of a leadership team building of a community of conscious leaders called Vista Mundo. Is that with Carol?
Carol,
I'll have to get her last name. I'm envisioning her, long, beautiful hair from Canada.
Actually, Carol and there may be a Carol involved, but that actually is another offshoot of the Evolutionary Business Council. So Pam Bain, Teresa de Gravois. I was living in Costa Rica actually a number of years ago now, and we started that collaboration.
Well, welcome.
Hi.
Welcome, whether you have a Carol or not. I feel like this is a Karen moment. No, I'm just kidding. So, sorry, guys. You know, it's always like this. So tell us a little bit about how you got into audiobooks, because people are listening to them more than ever now.
Yeah, I call it my chocolate and peanut butter moment. I had been coaching and consulting for a long time, building businesses internationally. But I have a deep and abiding love of anything involving a microphone. Always have, kind of came out of the womb that way. And I had a paid hobby as a voice actor. I ended up taking some narration classes through Pat Fraley, who's one of the, if any voice actors out there, one of the best in the industry for training in audiobook narration. Learned about the industry as well and had that chocolate and peanut butter moment where I was like, wait, I know all of my colleagues, all of my clients are producing and publishing books for their businesses and bestseller campaigns, but I don't think anyone's doing audiobooks. Why? And that just led me into a rabbit hole. Because in learning about the industry, I was learning, fastest growing space in publishing. And now this is going back half a dozen years. And no one was talking about audiobooks then. Really, things had just gone digital not that long before, and the merger of Audible and Amazon had happened, and so on and so forth. So it took me actually a couple of years to come around to offering the services, but I piloted some done-for-you audiobook services at a conference to see what the reception would be like. And within a year, it took over 75% of my company. So between that and the podcasting, which I was already involved with, and I was already involved with coaching people around having their voice be their instrument of leadership, it all just kind of came together into a beautiful microphone-based whole deal.
That is so cool. So yeah. I'm actually an avid audiobook reader, I guess if you call it a reader. It's so funny. My friends make fun of me because they're like, what are you reading now? How do you have so much time to read? But I also run about 10 to 12 hours a week.
Oh,
So
that'll do it.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
my time. And I listen on 1.75. So
I
anytime
was
I have
wondering about that.
right. So anytime I have a conversation now, you're all talking like this to me.
Slowly.
Right.
Yes.
And it's funny because everybody who listens to audiobooks tells me the same thing. Like I'm having a conversation. I'm like, give birth. Like, why are they talking so much faster than you? So I know that audiobooks are very widely used. There are people all over who, my particular thing is exercise, but a lot of people who commute, they don't watch TV, things like that. So what do you find? I actually heard a statistic that more people finish audiobooks than they do regular books. Is that true?
Yeah, well, the average audiobook listener will finish more than a dozen books a year, whereas the average, and these are American numbers,
Hmm.
folks in the U.S. Finishes fewer than 4 books a year in the print or ebook or whatever. So, yeah, audiobook listeners tend to inhale them like potato chips.
Mm, I
Yeah.
I agree. I agree with that. So once upon a time, I wrote a 30 how to write a book in 30-day book, which I never released into print, but I recorded it. And
Uh-huh. How'd that
and
go?
I well, I thought it'd be super easy peasy. And
Sure.
that's what you and I were talking to talk about today is it's not easy. So,
No.
what are some of the big mistakes that people make?
Oh boy. Okay. So first of all, I want to preface this that I don't want to scare you off from the idea of doing an audiobook, but just like anything else, there's a difference between doing something and doing it well. You can launch a podcast in a day or two. Can you do it well? Can you launch a book can you write a book in 30 days? Sure. Can you do it well? So really that's the distinction we're looking for here. So can you record your own audiobook? Abso-freaking-lutely. Can you do it well? Well, here's what you need to kind of know. So mistakes that people make are jumping in without doing the research. Podcasts are different than audiobooks. I get a lot of podcasters, I get a lot of public speakers, a lot of experts who say, well, I do a lot of speaking, so it'll be easy for me to do my audiobook. Yes, and as we say in improv. So it is not the same animal. It is definitely not the same animal. Audiobook narration is a different skill set because you are reading and you are speaking and performing at the same time. And that requires different parts of your brain to be active. It also requires different technical requirements. You can get away with all kinds of stuff on podcasting, like I'm doing right now. Like I'm on a headset microphone, could not do that with an audiobook. You're in a big open room, you could not do that with an audiobook.
And I've got
Uh,
a window right there, which
you
makes it
have a window.
work.
Yes, no windows. So there's different levels of quality audio, things having to do with stuff called like noise floor and dBs and megahertz and bit rates and all of these technical things that you really need to know up front if you're going to do it on your own, or you need to know enough to be dangerous if you're going to hire somebody to help you with it. Because we've even had books come to us where I've had a publisher um, friend or colleague say, hey, they went and produced their audiobook on their own, and yes, they worked with a producer, but we just need it published. Can you handle the files and the publishing and the distribution? Yeah, sure. And inevitably, even with people who claim to have produced 10, 12, 15 audiobooks already, we'll end up with issues with the files, where they're formatted wrong, or there's not enough at the beginning or end, room noise at the beginning or end, that they haven't included the right elements that are required by Audible or other platforms. Like there's just a myriad of T's that need to be crossed, I's that need to be dotted, that in other forms of audio you don't have to do. So that's really, really important, and probably the biggest set of mistakes that people make in not being prepared in the first place to get the audiobook done. That's really the big one. So before I move on, I mean, I could take 20 minutes just listing mistakes, but I think that'll make people want to slit their wrists. So let's not do that.
Well, but that's a good point. One of the things and I just shared this with you before we started, I thought, okay, I'm going to go to my friend's studio and I'm just going to knock this thing out in a day. It's only like 50 pages.
Hmm.
Wow. Look, you're like, uh-huh. Um, Yeah, it wasn't that easy. We ended up breaking into chapters. Breath. These are actual real voice actors who have studied breath. That was my biggest thing. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, breathing, everything comes down to breathing in terms of vocal performance. That's the number one thing. And as the more that your stress level goes up or the more concentration that's needed, the more your breath gets impinged upon. And if you have not read your book out loud, it's going to feel like a foreign object in your mouth. It literally feels like a foreign object in your mouth. You like, how did I write this sentence? Like I can't you feel like you're wrapping your face around the words and it feels so weird. So, going into a studio is certainly an option with an audio engineer or a director. We did used to actually produce our authors' audiobooks that way, hooking them up with local studios. And then I would train them personally before going into the booth because they're not going to train you. They're not going to show you, the technique ahead of time. They're not going to show you mic technique necessarily. They might give you a little bit. They might help you catch your mistakes. But an audio engineer is not the same as an audiobook director. They're two totally different things. And so one is about performance, the other one is about sound quality. So even if you get good sound quality working with an audio engineer in a studio, you're not necessarily going to be directed through the process, which is where we come into things like phrasing, performance, energy, the consistency of your sound. Most people don't realize they sound different in the morning than they do in the evening. You sound different at the beginning of a 3-hour session than at the end of a 3-hour session. And if you can't maintain that energy, your audiobook is going to sound very inconsistent. And that's part of the process. And it's hard to hear on your own. And you also can't hear most of the time if you're making any weird, repetitious patterns with your voice. Very, very common is something called uptalk. And uptalk is when you sound like you're ending your sentences with a question. And it happens a lot when you're reading lists, and it makes you sound like you don't know what you're talking about. And so, especially with nonfiction, which is our wheelhouse, we have people who are incredible experts, and they come off as uncertain when they start reading their book because there's this subconscious thing that happens that makes you kind of question, is it like, okay, do you understand me? Is the subconscious message that's being broadcast? And like I said, it happens a lot in lists. So instead of, he picked up a paper, a pen, and a mouse. People will say he picked up a paper, a pen, and a mouse, and it sounds totally different. It's a real authority underminer. So it's all these kinds of things that come into play. Like I said, it's kind of endless, and the most important thing somebody can do is rehearse their book, read it out loud before you go in, because that is where the breath is going to get you the most. Those long sentences that you didn't realize how many commas you actually used or didn't use.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a beautiful, well-constructed sentence, but it's a paragraph long. Yeah.
Right. So you're probably out there thinking right now, like, well, how important is that voice? A while back, several years ago, I listened to an fiction Audible book, and they let the author, it was one of those that's mystery novels, several characters, they brought in, different actors for it. And one of the people who read the book as one of the characters was the author.
Weird. That's
And
unusual.
she had a lisp.
Oh dear.
And it was like, did nobody, she's a big name author. She might not even be alive anymore. But it was like, did anybody tell her she had a lisp? Like, why didn't these people say something? It was such a turnoff. I didn't finish the book. It was
Mm.
so incredibly, incredibly odd. So it really is important that you have the right voice on there, as well as you do a lot of audiobooks for where people read their own books, right?
Yeah, about 80% of our books are still professionally narrated because most of the folks we work with are incredibly busy. And what we find is that there's two schools of thinking on narrating your own audiobook. Yes, it would be great if you're using that book to build an audience You're building it, a platform, so to speak, as a speaker, as a consultant, all of those kinds of things. So in that sense, is it important that your voice be on it? Yes. But if you're doing a memoir, counterintuitively, and especially if it has multiple kind of characters, people in your family, things like that, most of the time we don't have people do their own memoirs
Hmm.
because there are multiple characters in the book. Also because memoirs tend to be incredibly emotional for the authors who are reading them. And and the third reason is that we don't necessarily see a difference in the sales numbers on the back end.
Really?
And that's a key factor because if your time is super valuable, there's an opportunity cost when you do your audiobook. And, all things, when we do audiobook packages, there's a similar, we try to keep the investment in it, very similar either way for people. But, people have to decide where their time is best used. And sometimes your voice just isn't the best voice to use in terms of the quality of your voice. There are brilliant people out there who you might want to hear for 45 minutes doing a keynote, but you don't want to hear for 8 hours on an audiobook.
So what you're saying is Mike Tyson should not read his own book.
Yeah, I would prefer not.
Okay.
I would really prefer not. We could let him do the introduction. We could do that.
There you go. And I have heard people do their introductions. I just read a book where the introduction and the summary were done by the author and the rest
Yep.
was narrated by a professional. And I thought that was a really good touch with it as well. So when you've got this microphone and it's super sensitive, one of the things I
Mhm.
noticed when I recorded was I puffed, like I was
All the
breathing.
plosives. Yes.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
breathing, but I didn't understand it until I heard it. Is that is
Yeah.
that pretty common?
Yeah, they're called plosives. So your P's, a little less for B's, T's. What happens is that the breath hits the wiring in the microphone, and it makes the sound wave basically pop in either end. If you're looking at it visually, you'll actually see like a big spike, and plosives are a problem. And that's why with most professional mics, they'll have a screen in front of them, and it's something that also in voice acting that you do learn to control is your plosives. The other thing that happens a lot is mouth noise, which is that kind of sound, which is horrifying. I mean, I don't know anybody who doesn't cringe when you hear that. And I've actually heard a couple of audiobooks narrated by the author where they've got a lot of mouth noise, and I just can't. I just like it's just it's one of those things. I would rather listen to someone chewing than hear that. And that's something that has to be addressed. Sometimes it's dry lips and they need chapstick. Sometimes they need a sip of water, and they've got, a dry mouth, dry throat, a couple of different things. It's sometimes I don't think you see it so much anymore, but it used to be if you walked into a studio, a lot of times they'd have a bowl of apples or a bowl of green apples in kind of their green room. And one of the reasons is because the citric acid from the apples or something, a chemical compound in the apples, if you take just a bite and chew it, it actually helps to kind of thin out, not to be gross, thin out your saliva, and then you don't get as much as the mouth noise on the microphone. So things like that.
Okay.
You probably, things like jewelry, rustly clothing. Your microphone will pick up everything.
Wow. So can you get those? You just mentioned like you were listening to it. Did they not take it out of the book? Can you take those things out?
Mouth noise, you really can't because it's part of the speaking. You have to get the take without the mouth noise. Plosives you can fix usually. Sometimes you can really tell there's only so much magic, studio magic you can do in post production without making somebody sound mechanical.
Oh.
And you can filter things and do all kinds of stuff, but we want to get as much of the natural voice in there as possible because as you start to add technology on top of the voice, it starts to strip away some of the layers of the humanity that make the book so wonderful and that make that connection with the listener so great.
Wow. I just did that. Wow.
I know.
I've never done that before. Now it's going to become a new habit.
Sorry. Yeah.
So here's another downfall that you and I talked about. Self-publishing, when we do our books, we get the first proof back or the first draft, and then you start making corrections. And our authors always complain, this is so tedious. You have to do that on audio too. How involved is that?
Well, this is why we do full direction with our authors' audiobooks. So we're able to remote into people's home offices, make sure they have good audio quality set up. You don't need a super expensive microphone. The mic we recommend is about $120. We make sure that you're in the right space to do it in your home or your office. And then we have a director who comes in and remotes in, does all the recording for you, and that minimizes the number of mistakes that get made. And those mistakes are not called mistakes, they're called pickups. That's the industry term. So when we go back then and our excuse me, our hello, line editors. Our editors will listen to back to the book and they'll proof the book as they're editing. And so that proofing process is the process of picking up the mistakes in the book. And there's always going to be a few, even with this process that we use. And those get put into a spreadsheet. And then you have to schedule another recording session to do those pickups. And those have to be done a specific way because, again, they have to be spliced into the original audio seamlessly. So you have to be in the same place. You want to record at the same time of day. You want to make sure that your voice hasn't changed significantly, and then you want to have that the same energy. So you have to listen to the way that you did it before, and then do it correctly this time. And that's, again, this is why we record the pickups with our authors as they go. It just makes things a lot easier. So all you have to do is focus on the performance. If you're doing this on your own and you also have to run the tech and make sure that your room noise is right and that you're starting and stopping and you're kind of monitoring your own mistakes at the same time, every layer of concentration that takes makes it exponentially more difficult as you go along. Can you do it? Yes. Do I recommend it? Oh God, no.
Oh, you,
So
you know, it's funny. I hope all of you listening who complained about that edit on your book just heard that, because that edit is nothing
that
compared
is
to going
nothing.
back and trying to match a voice and do all of that. So, a lot of people who record books, it takes hours. How do you keep your voice in good shape? Because this is not something you're used to doing. Or can I even ask that? Because
Sure.
imagine you'd start to get hoarse after a few days.
Well, you really want to split it up. A lot of audiobook narrators really don't record for more than 3 hours a day. Some people go longer. They really have their instrument is to a point where they feel comfortable doing 5 hours of recording a day, but that's pretty rare, actually. It's much more common for audiobook narrators to do about 3 hours a day on any particular book before your voice really starts to get tired from that continual strain. So we don't block anybody out for longer than a 3-hour recording session. More often than not, it's two to keep that voice quality. But we test that out with folks. That first session, we usually block 3 hours and then see how they do. And if their energy really starts to drop, we go, okay, there's your limit.
Mhm.
Let's stop there, and then we'll just pick it up the next day. And then we usually block out 2 or 3 hours a day over the space of a week, depending on how long the book is. For a professional audiobook company like ours, every finished hour of audio takes about 5 hours to produce. So you have to keep that in mind between the recording, the proofing, the editing, the mastering, the pickups, and all of that. It there's a 4 to 5 hour process involved with that.
And you mentioned to me last week, I think, that there is a usually that hour contains X amount of words.
Yeah, a finished hour of audio is equal to about 10,000 print words. So if you're ever looking for, how much do audiobook cost to produce? Audiobook cost is usually based on how much the word count of the book is, not how many pages it is, not because you got font sizes and layouts and all kinds of stuff. It is the word count of the book. So, for example, a 50,000 word book is about a 5 hour audiobook.
Unless you're me, and then it's about two and a quarter or two and three quarters hours.
While listening to it on double speed, absolutely.
Yes, it absolutely is. So where can we find out more about you and what you do, and if they're thinking about putting an audiobook together?
Well, you can check out twinflamesstudios.com. That's the name of my company. And we have all kinds of audiobook samples up there, as well as podcasts that we work with and launch for companies. And we just love the whole point is to amplify people's messages around the world. You know, podcasts, audiobooks, books in general are low hanging fruit for people to be able to start to get to know people, start to get to know leaders, and also to start to make changes in your life. So they're kind of the one of the easiest, most accessible ways for transformation to happen on the planet. So that's what we're up to.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being on today. I hope she didn't dissuade you, but my point today was really it's harder than it looks.
Well, it can be easier too. We're here to help. So thank you so much, Juliet.